Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy it here. Don't forget to subscribe and put a like. It helps me to keep making more content for you. Enjoy. I used to work nights at a 7-Eleven in the countryside. It was somewhere in Saitama, Japan. I won't say the exact location, but 7-Eleven is pretty much the same all over really, just with more or less people coming in depending on where you are. Being in the countryside, mine obviously had less people, mainly delinquent biker kids stopping by for cigarettes, or people on their way home after work or something. There was one customer though whose memory will haunt me forever. As I said, my 7-Eleven was in the countryside, so it was basically the brightest thing around as far as the eye could see at night. The day this happened was a quiet weekday night. I think Wednesday or Thursday, perhaps. I've always found that those 2 days tended to blur together the most. No one had come in for over an hour now, and I had done all my nighttime duties for basically the entire night. I was working alone, as I very often did. The volume of traffic at night in this particular location could never justify paying another person to work there. I was just lazily wiping the counter for the 5th time that night, just listening to the cicadas and crickets chirping outside. I was so focused on my wiping that I didn't even notice a figure at the window staring in at me. I jumped in surprise upon looking up and seeing him, and did a polite nod. It was a wrinkly old man with these unsettling and dead-looking eyes. Unusually, he did not return my greeting gesture. Instead, he just kept staring at me. I think it was about 3 a.m. or so. What was this old man who was pushing at least 75 years old doing out here so late at night? It's not exactly unheard of, I suppose, but he wasn't actually doing anything apart from staring at me. He had not made any attempt to enter the store either. I was starting to get really creeped out. The outside of our location was pitch black and extremely quiet. Like I said, I hadn't seen any customers in over an hour. In fact, I hadn't even seen any cars passing by the road in that long either. Another thought then occurred to me. There were no cars in the car park, and there weren't any houses nearby for miles. Either this was a ghost, and I didn't really believe in ghosts at all, or it was a suspicious person. I couldn't really think of anything else it could be. If the man was a ghost, he was very solid looking for one of those. The longer he stared at me, the more creeped out I felt. I came to a decision, and I'm not really proud of it. I figured that if the man wasn't going to come inside the store, he was not a customer. And therefore, whatever was going on with him, I should just put it out of my mind. I pulled the blinds down over the window he was staring in from. My hand was shaking as I did so. It was so eerie, being mere centimeters away from his face, with him staring into my eyes the whole time. I just couldn't look away. The old guy didn't even budge a single inch, despite me being so close to him. I felt all the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I could see his chest visibly moving up and down, so obviously not a ghost. After I'd closed the blinds, I went back to the counter and stood there very uneasy. Was the man going to enter or not? I really didn't know what to do. It felt strange just leaving him out there. The creepiness of the situation had put my mind in a bit of a panic, and I wasn't really thinking straight. After a while, I realized that I should probably go and see if he needed some assistance or something. After all, it seemed like there was something wrong with him. I mustered the courage to go to the front window and raise the blinds once more. To my surprise, the man was still there. We were locked in a staring contest that I just couldn't look away from. His eyes kept getting wider and wider. The old man slowly brought his head right up against the glass, softly at first, but he began to bang it with his face harder and harder. I had to do something to stop this man. I ran out and tried to stop him from hitting the window with his face, but he was much stronger than I expected. He bashed his head against it again and again. I tried harder to stop him. I didn't want to hurt the man, and I didn't want him to hurt himself either. I managed to gain control of him for a brief moment, and then he did the unimaginable. He started to yell out this continuous, unintelligible sound. The longer I held on, the louder he yelled, until his scream was so loud that it was actually starting to injure my ears. I ran inside and called the police, with him still bellowing outside. I tried my best to explain this strange situation as I could. I was extremely shaken up by these events. Luckily, the man was screaming so loud the operator could even hear him on the other end of the phone line. The police arrived 15 minutes later. They seemed to be familiar with the man, so they calmed him down and loaded him into their patrol vehicle. They took the man away without really explaining anything to me. About half an hour later, they came back and explained to me that the old man lived in a care facility about 10 minutes away by car. That meant it was 30 to 40 minutes away on foot. The old man, before his mental deterioration, actually used to live in a house where the convenience store now stood. Apparently, it had been sold to pay for his care. He actually escaped from time to try and go home, and couldn't understand why his house was no longer there. I left the job after learning that. I knew that if something like that happened again, I could just call the police. But whenever I worked nights after this, I got real sad, imagining I could see the old man's dead stare once again. I was always on edge and very jumpy, and even lost a bit of sleep over it. This was about 8 to 10 years back, so I'm guessing the old man has since passed on. I wonder sometimes if even his spirit is still trying to find its way home to this day. I'm uncomfortable sharing certain details about my story, so I'll be purposefully vague. This story happened back when I was in middle school. Against my wishes, my mother had enrolled me into an after-school program called ELP, which stands for Extended Learning Program. I already hated school enough, and being forced to stay there for an extra hour just pissed me off. I would usually get out at 4, but with that program, I was stuck until 5. I did well in school and didn't really need the extra time. My only guess is that my parents wanted to keep me out of the house for another hour. My house was a short walk away from the school, so I would usually be back by 5:20 at the latest. On the day in question, a huge storm passed through our town during the school day. When 5 o'clock rolled around, there was still an overcast sky, which made things much darker than usual. As soon as I left the school grounds, I noticed this suspicious old station wagon moving very slowly down the street toward me. Maybe it was just a confused grandmother of one of the students or something, unsure of where the drop-off area was. I simply did my best to ignore it and continue on. It wasn't until I was a block down the road that I realized this vehicle was very specifically tailing me. I looked behind me to see something truly terrifying. Behind the wheel of that vehicle was someone wearing a white mask with a smiley face drawn on it. I should have taken off on foot then, but instead I just stood there like an idiot as the car approached me. Soon, the wagon came to a stop next to me. I looked directly at the driver's creepy mask before a muffled voice spoke to me. I didn't respond. "Need a ride, kid?" I looked to the ground and shook my head. When I looked back, I was horrified to see that the driver was now pointing a gun at me. I took a few steps back. The driver then pulled the trigger, and I heard a loud clicking sound. "You're dead." The wagon then took off down the street. I stood there in total shock. Some jackass thought it funny to point a gun at a 14-year-old kid. I ran home and immediately told my parents about what happened to me. The police were called, and apparently they ended up finding and arresting the man a couple of hours later. He was outside a grocery store. Apparently, he suffered from schizophrenia and had gone off his meds. The gun he pointed at me was real, but it had not been loaded. Needless to say, he was locked up in a facility indefinitely until his treatment made him better. The good news is that after that happened, my parents felt really guilty, and I never had to go to that stupid after-school program again. This happened back in the late 90s. I was around 9 years old, I believe. To give you some background information, I grew up in a cul-de-sac toward the back of my neighborhood. Our school was only a mile down the road. The only crimes I'd ever heard about was when high school athletes would prank their teammates by covering their cars with toilet paper and Cool Whip or something. Needless to say, our parents were never really all that worried about our safety. I remember I was sitting in my front yard, waiting for my friend to get home from soccer practice. All of a sudden, I heard a woman scream from somewhere close by. I looked over to see my next-door neighbor, Heather, running as fast as she could down the street and crying hysterically. She flew past me into her house before I could even ask what was going on. When I looked back to where she came from, I saw a white vehicle cruising down our street slowly. The vehicle looked severely rusted and beaten down as well, the kind of thing that wouldn't have looked out of place in a junkyard. Through the tinted windows, I could just about make out a shadowy figure in the driver's seat. The car's engine revved up as it sped off and disappeared. I didn't really see any details of the driver's face. However, I could tell they were looking directly at me as they took off. Even at my young age, I knew something threatening when I saw it. Once the initial shock wore off, I ran inside. I don't know why I didn't tell my parents about the incident. I just kept telling myself it was none of my business. Maybe it was Heather's boyfriend and they got into a fight or something. If she really was in some kind of danger, I would leave it to her to tell someone about it. A few days later, I overheard my mom talking to a friend of hers about someone that was apparently trying to lure kids into a white vehicle in the next subdivision over from ours. I remember cutting into that conversation and saying, "Mom, do you know if it was really a white car? Because I saw Heather the other day running away from someone in a white car." They completely ignored me, saying it was rude to interrupt their conversation and I shouldn't be joking about such a serious thing. Honestly, not much happened after that. Again, this was many years ago. To this day, I believe that I witnessed Heather only mere seconds away from being abducted by whoever that was. I don't recall if they ever apprehended the suspect. All I can do is hope they were never successful for their further attempts to attack someone. This happened when I was working in a convenience store near a cram school. I used to work late at night, and I was known as a bit of a senior there. I had more experience than all the university students who worked there part-time. It was a great place to work if I'm being honest. I have some really good memories of being there. This experience, though, tops the list of memories, and it's not exactly a fond memory either. It's definitely something I'll never forget, though. Our convenience store didn't get all that busy at nighttime, so me and the other staff members often found ourselves free on most of the nights. When we had this free time, we'd kind of just hang out in the back together, eat, and read magazines. It was really great, actually. One night, while we were doing our usual thing of hanging out in the back, I was on shift with a junior, and I was checking the security cameras. I really liked this particular guy. He was nice, and we had a good back and forth. We used to have a lot of fun discussions about movies and stuff. Always just a great partner to have around. The monitor in the back room was split up into 4 sections. 2 parts of the screen showed the cash registers, and the other 2 parts of the screen showed portions of the aisles. When I looked at the screen, I saw there was a woman stood by the magazine rack. Nothing wrong with that, of course. Customers come in and out all the time, and often browse things for a moment. However, this was a bit different. Neither of us had heard the entrance chime when she came in. She had this long, dark hair, and looked very disheveled, for lack of a better term. My coworker noticed her as well, and said, "Hey, I didn't hear the chime, did you?" To be honest, there had been occasions where the chime didn't ring at all in the past, so we carried on talking without giving it much thought. What we usually did was just come out of the back when the customer approached the register. After a while, though, the woman didn't appear to be moving at all. She was just standing there perfectly still like a statue. She didn't even grab a magazine to browse. She was just kind of staring off into space. My coworker asked me if she was planning on shoplifting perhaps. It hadn't occurred to me, but it could be a possibility. It was pretty odd that she hadn't moved at all. We had an idea. We were going to go out and check on her. We would go in a pincer movement, coming from either side. You know, make it look like we were stalking the shelves or dusting them, to ensure that she wasn't actually trying to steal something. We walked right up to the magazine rack, but when we arrived, she was nowhere to be seen. We headed back to the back room, thinking she must have left without buying anything. Oh well, whatever. When we got back to the staff room, though, I looked at the monitor again and was shocked to see the woman standing in the same spot at the magazine rack. Well, how the hell did she do that? Was the monitor malfunctioning or something? We spoke about it amongst ourselves and decided to go out there and check once again. We headed out in the same pinching movement as before, toward the magazine rack. Once again, she was nowhere to be found. How was she doing this? We rushed back to the staff room. I, for one, was absolutely chilled by what was going on. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I couldn't explain what was happening here. We were quiet. The first thing my colleague did was check the monitor. He told me that once again the woman with the dark hair was gone. I was feeling relieved. I thought he must have been feeling the same. Something weird was definitely going on, though. I wanted to see the monitors for myself, so I leaned over my colleague's shoulder to get a closer look. "Don't move," he said. I listened to him and froze in place. He sounded scared. I stayed next to him thinking, what the hell is going on? I was worried. Was he all right? Did something happen? I looked at the reflection on the monitor, not the live feed, but the reflection on the glass. I could see our faces, but there was something else behind us as well, a figure that I immediately recognized. It was the woman we had seen earlier. I felt my back go completely stiff. We were frozen in place, watching that reflection for a minute straight. All of a sudden, she darted backwards and toward the left. We stayed there for another minute, too scared to move at all. I tried to calm myself down until I couldn't bear it anymore. I looked away and slowly turned around in fear, expecting to see her hiding somewhere behind us, but to my surprise, she was nowhere to be found. We both backed away from the monitors in silence. "Something's going on here," my colleague said, as if he wanted me to agree that he wasn't going mad. He looked at me with these pleading eyes. I looked away and said, "Yeah, I agree." By the time I looked back, he was completely fixated on the monitors again. I felt my heart sink in my chest. What the hell was going to happen next? I looked at the screen, and once again the woman was back out by the magazine rack, only this time she was turned up and facing the camera. She smiled and slowly opened her mouth and began to say something that I couldn't quite make out. I'm not exactly a lip reader here. Without saying anything, my colleague ran out the back door, leaving me alone in the store. As much as I also wanted to run out right behind him, I had a responsibility as the senior staff member. I spent the remainder of the shift stood out front by the register. I figured that if I didn't look at the monitors, then I could visibly observe whatever the woman was doing. But as far as I know, since I didn't check the monitors, that was the last time I saw that woman that night. I was pissed at my colleague for sure, but he apologized very sincerely and I forgave him. It was the strangest and scariest experience I've ever had. I don't think I'll ever be able to explain what exactly happened that night. My name is Austin. I'm a 26-year-old man, and this story took place about a month ago. This occurred on a trip my fiancé and I were on. We had just moved down to Florida for a chance at some better opportunities, especially for myself from where I was living previously. My fiancé had to sacrifice a lot for this transition though, so to help ease the stress a bit, we decided to go on a weekend trip to Universal Orlando Resort and have a fun time together. We had planned out everything ahead of time. With the tickets being so much money, we opted to go for a cheaper hotel to bring the price down a bit. Turned out that was a big mistake. We arrived at the hotel the day before we were supposed to visit the resort. We could immediately see why it was so cheap. The sign said Quality Inn, but from the looks of it, it was previously a run-down hotel some company had bought and slapped their own name on the sign. The room was nothing special at all. In fact, as soon as I sat down on the bed, the frame broke right away. First clue as to just how bad this place really was. We didn't spend too much time in the room though, as we planned to go to a movie that night anyway. We just quickly dropped off our bags and left. By the time we got back, it was around 11 p.m. or so. I was really tired and I had quite a bad migraine. I quickly changed for bed and laid down, hoping I could just fall asleep. My head was really throbbing. My fiancé did the same shortly after, and before long we both drifted off. Before I continue, I'll explain the layout of the room briefly. As soon as you walk in, to the right are two beds with a night table in between them. To the left was a table and a dresser where the TV sat, and if you kept going straight, you would walk to the sink and bathroom area. A typical hotel room layout, really. My fiancée always needs to face the door when she sleeps, as it makes her feel more at ease. She was pressed up right against my chest, so it woke me immediately the moment I felt her suddenly jolt up. She tapped on my shoulder and whispered to me that she could hear someone at the door. She said it sounded like they were trying to get it open. I couldn't hear anything myself, but the sound of her voice made me believe she was not making this up. We sat there listening in for what felt like forever. It was only around 10 more seconds before I did hear something. It was the sound of someone trying to open the door with a key card. Before I even had the chance to speak, the door suddenly opened. Fortunately, my fiancé was smart and had put the door latch on before we went to bed. Through the crack in the door, I could just about see an eye peering in at us. I immediately jumped up from the bed and yelled, "Wrong room, buddy!" The man then mumbled something unintelligible. Whoever it was, they seemed to be under the influence of something, or speaking in a language I couldn't understand. What he did next, though, didn't need words to explain. He tried with his whole body to shove the door open. I yelled at him again, this time with more force in my voice, trying to scare him away. I'm not the most imposing guy, but I am somewhat well built for my height and size. I was unable to, though. After I shouted at the man, he stopped pushing on the door for a brief moment before charging his shoulder into it, trying to break it down. My fiancé screamed and told me to stop the man from coming in. From what I could see through the door's crack, the guy was pretty hefty. Had to be at least 6'1" and over 250 pounds. There was no way I was going to be able to stop him with just strength alone. I grabbed the car keys off the table and held them in my hand with the keys between my fingers. I decided that if this man managed to get into our room, I would swing until I could not anymore. I ran over to the door and flung my whole body against it. throwing the man back just enough for the door to shut again. He immediately charged back and threw his whole weight into it, screaming something I couldn't understand. Next to the door, there was a window where I finally got a good glimpse of the man. It confirmed his predictions of his size compared to mine. To my surprise, I also saw a woman who I could only assume was his wife, along with 2 kids by their side. I couldn't believe this guy was acting this way in front of his own family. I was snapped back to reality by my fiancée screaming that she was going to call the police. Suddenly, the man stopped, and I could see him ushering the woman and kids away into an SUV. Moments later, they shot off into the night. I didn't know exactly where they went, but I told my fiancée to call the front desk anyways, to let them know what just happened. Nobody answered, so I decided to go to the desk myself and speak to whoever was working that shift that night. I walked into the lobby where a line was already forming, so I had to wait. After about 20 minutes, I was second in line when a lady approached the counter and spoke. When she started to speak, the words she said sent a chill down my spine. "Hey, we just used this key card to get into the room, but there were already people in there. It was the wife, the man who'd almost busted down my door." I immediately started to look around. Once I looked behind me and out the doors that opened into the lobby, I could see the same man standing there beside his SUV. I didn't make a move, not wanting to draw attention to myself. I turned my head back toward the desk and kept it that way. The lady left with a new key card. It was then that I approached the desk and explained what happened to me. The lady behind the desk told me it was her fault. She had given those people the key to our room by accident. I was so angry that this woman seemed to act as if whatever had just happened to my fiancé and I wasn't anything to be particularly concerned about. I told her to write down a note that I would be back in the morning to speak with the manager about leaving early and getting a refund. I was more pissed off than I cared to admit. My fiancé didn't want to stay there for the night, but it was already too late to find another place. We relented, and once morning hit, we packed our bags and made our way to the front desk. We fully expected the manager to have been filled in on what happened, but once we got there, we found out that was not the case at all. The manager didn't know anything, and even said he'd asked the woman working the night shift if anything in particular had happened that night. She told him no, that nothing had. I was more pissed off now. The manager gave us a refund and checked us out early, while apologizing profusely. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. Thankfully, the rest of the trip was pretty great, and we had a good time at the resort. I'm glad my fiancé had the awareness to put the latch on the door that night, because without it, that man could have simply walked right in. Even with his family standing right there, he acted like a deranged lunatic. I was prepared to attack him if he managed to get inside. Something really horrible could have happened that night over a simple misunderstanding. Always be aware of your surroundings and never compromise when it comes to your personal safety. This happened during the summer of 1977. It was either late July or early August. I was hiking with 3 friends of mine. Back in those days, I was an avid mountain hiker. We were on a 3,000-meter hiking course called the Uraginza, which is part of the Japanese Alps. That hike is definitely not for the faint-hearted. I just want to briefly describe it for you. The course duration is about 4 nights and 5 days. However, if you're a very fast hiker, it's possible to do it in just 3. That was not the case for us, though. The duration also doesn't take the weather into consideration either. It's highly recommended you add at least 1 extra night to your schedule to be able to adapt to changes in the weather. The area is well known for its extreme steepness, but the trail is well maintained. The advice most people give is to walk at a consistent and steady pace, especially at the beginning of the hike. This would help you avoid overexhaustion. On the second night, we were set to be staying at a hut in the mountains. The hut was pretty empty at the time. It had lights that you had to generate yourself, and a TV as well. I have to say, the food was very nice. I bet it's changed a bit nowadays. Overall, though, it was a pleasant experience. All the nights were out by 9 p.m. Like my group, I imagine the other hikers were probably exhausted or eager to get an early start at hiking the following morning. There were about 3 others in there with us, in this big open room. I crawled into the thin bedding when the lights went out and got ready for sleep. My friends and I were sleeping close together to share some of our warmth. The hut was dark, but it wasn't silent. There was light snoring all around us, and there was another sound as well. It sounded like someone was listening to a radio at a low volume. It was tuned in to this fuzzy-sounding station, but occasionally the volume would spike and get much clearer. I wanted to ignore it, but I kind of couldn't. It was very irritating. I didn't say anything, though. I figured that whoever it was listening to this would shut off the radio soon enough. The radio was not turned off, though. It was getting later and later, and I wanted to sleep badly because we had a lot of ground to cover the following day. I got up and went to find a staff member. The staff member came back with me into the sleeping area, and we went in search of the owner of this mysterious radio to ask them to turn it off. Because the staff member was pacing around looking at everything, it piqued the interest of several of the other hikers. Before long, everyone was wide awake, but we still weren't able to find the owner of that radio. No one came forward to claim it as theirs. The staff member went over to the area where we'd all stored our gear and found out the radio was playing in someone's backpack. Once again, no one came forward to try and say it was their radio or even their backpack. The staff member unzipped the bag fully and took the radio out. He turned it off and we stood there a little confused. The staff member broke the silence. He said he recognized this bag. Apparently, the guy who owned the bag had arrived with a load of gear and seemed very well prepared, but had never come back the following morning to retrieve his gear. Apparently, he just disappeared. He left in the middle of the night on the route down from the mountain hut. It would take longer than a day to go back if he needed to. It's unknown why the owner of this radio and bag left without his belongings, or even his coat either. The staff member had a look on his face that seemed to say, "I've seen this before," so I asked him what he thought happened to the owner of the radio. He replied that there was of course no way the man could have gotten down in just one day. Even in the summer it would be considered suicidal, if you catch my drift. We all thought it was kind of weird that the radio had suddenly turned on all by itself then. As we spoke, about to put it down, it turned on once more. Something about the fragments I could hear in the darkness of that hut and the lonely mountain made me think it was someone trying to contact us. Some of the words that came across through the radio stuck with me. It almost seemed like someone was calling from beyond, asking for some sort of help. It sent shivers up my spine just thinking back on it. I remember just hearing the words, "I'm right here," over and over. I'm not sure if that meant that this spirit was someplace else, or still here in our realm. I think about the owner of that radio every now and then, and I can't help but wonder about what led him to leave the hut on his suicidal mission in the middle of the night, what led up to his final moments. We turned the radio off again after. It was spooking us out too much, but I wonder if even more communications would have come through if we left the radio on for the entire night. I'll start off by saying that this isn't my story. It's a messed up experience from when my older cousin Dylan was just a kid. He told me about this recently, and I'll be saying it from his point of view moving forward. I think everyone has memories from their childhood that bother them. I'm 24 years old now, but this is something that I'll never forget. When I was in elementary school, I did what was called the extended day program. It was essentially a daycare after school for kids whose parents worked late. This happened to me when I was in the 2nd grade, and I was 7 years old at the time. My parents worked late on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. My older sister Alyssa had a part-time job at McDonald's as well. Usually my parents would come pick me up on Tuesdays and Thursdays. My sister would get off and pick me up at around 4:30, which was an hour and a half after school ended. It was a chilly day in March, and we were all on the playground just sort of messing around. It was about 4:10 or so when the teacher who was watching us on the playground, Mr. McCann, told me that I was going home. He walked me back into the school where I grabbed up all my stuff and walked out to the lobby. There I met a young woman who was no older than 30 years old. She was skinny, about 5'2", and had extremely long and dark hair, with tanned skin and a very pointy nose, had lots of makeup on, and a nose ring and tattoo on her left arm. She knelt down and asked me if I was Dylan. Me being a dumb kid, I said yes, and she introduced herself as Heather. She told me she worked with my sister and was here to pick me up, since apparently my sister had to work extra late that day. As a side note, she never once mentioned my sister by name. Anyway, she grabbed my hand and started to drag me out to her car together. Obviously, I didn't yet realize anything was wrong. No alarm bells were going off in my head or anything. Again, I was a dumb kid. When we got to her car, she offered me some M&Ms. I thought she was just being really nice to me, so I ate them. I know what you're most probably thinking, but luckily they just turned out to be normal M&Ms. At first, nothing seemed off at all. Heather actually took me down the right way that my parents and sister would always take me to and from school. It wasn't until she passed right by my street that I started to realize that something was off here. I told her that we'd passed by, but she only responded by saying okay and kept going down the main road. She no longer had that caring, friendly tone that she had when I met her less than 30 minutes before this. Now she seemed very cold and standoffish, not really caring about how nervous I was. I asked her if she could get me a Happy Meal, and she responded by telling me to shut up. After a couple of minutes of silence, I asked her another question, and her answer terrified me. "So, are you and Alyssa friends or something?" "Who's Alyssa?" My heart and lungs dropped to the pit of my stomach. Even as a kid, I knew that meant I was in serious danger. I started crying, afraid of what was going to happen next. Heather kept screaming for me to shut up, and even reached over and punched me a couple of times. Eventually, she got so fed up with me that she pulled over and put the car in park. She pulled out a roll of duct tape from the center console. Just like in an action movie, though, a police car just so happened to pull up behind us right on time. Heather immediately dropped the duct tape and slammed the car into drive, then floored it down the road. The speed limit was 30, but she was going at least 70. This lasted for about 5 minutes. I kept crying as Heather floored it even further down the road, taking turns at ridiculous speed. All of a sudden, we came upon 2 police cars blockading the road. She slammed on the brakes, sliding to a stop just before hitting them. She got out and started running immediately, but the cops were able to stop her before she got to the forest alongside the road. Heather was immediately taken into custody. One of the officers grabbed me and took me home in his car. When I got home, Melissa was sobbing, and as soon as she saw me, she hugged me for 2 minutes straight. My parents arrived home shortly after. They had heard about what happened, and were both very upset. That night, they had a very long talk with me about stranger danger. The police came back later and checked in on us. They asked me a few more questions as well. It turns out that Heather was not the woman's real name at all, and she had no connection to my sister whatsoever. Even though I had no idea at the time, the woman's ex-boyfriend was also on trial for child pornography and sex trafficking. What confuses me about all of this is how Heather even knew who I was. Keep in mind I was only 7, and this happened before social media and all that, so I have no idea how she could have found my information. I do have a theory though. Mr. McCann, the teacher that ran the after-school program, was fired after this incident. I saw in the news many years later that he had been charged with molesting a student at another school. He ended up taking his own life before he stood trial. I think there's a good chance that he sold me out to Heather, and they were connected. I have no proof of that, of course, and I'll never know for sure. All the kids out there listening, please be careful with strangers, and always listen to your parents when they warn you about the dangers of the world. To all parents listening, for the love of God, stress to your kids about stranger danger. Hopefully, Heather is either in jail or got some kind of help, and she'll never try to harm another kid ever again. I'll try to keep this as short as I can, because I don't really know a lot I can say about it. It's all very confusing to me. Despite this having happened a long time ago, it still sticks fresh in my memory. I've told this one to a couple of friends and family members, and we're all still left scratching our heads. So I'm opening it up to the internet. This happened when I was returning from Shiga Prefecture, which meant I was going through the mountains. You might not know exactly what that means if you've never been in the area, but it's a bunch of long and winding mountain roads going through forests and various trails. It was also nighttime, so it was basically pitch black out. It gets really, really dark in the mountains. I will admit I was going a little faster than I usually would. Like I said, it was nighttime, and if I'm honest, I should say it was late at night as well. I was way behind my schedule and wanted to get home and get some sleep. I was gunning it through these mountain roads, making some really good time, when something catastrophic happened. I felt like I'd just hit something, run over something. Based on the impact I felt, I would say it must have been no bigger than a basketball or something. Sadly, there are many wild things out in the mountains that could be that size. I screeched the car to a halt and pulled off to the side of the road. I parked and looked back, but I couldn't see anything in the road. That gave me a bit of relief. I did feel that I'd hit something though, so I knew I had to start searching. I got down on my hands and knees and looked beneath the car to see if I could see any damage. I couldn't see anything though. It was dark, so I grabbed my phone and activated the torch. I shone that bright light under my vehicle and searched all over. It didn't appear like there was any damage or dents or anything. It didn't seem like I'd hit anything at all. I double and triple checked the area, and I didn't find anything. I didn't think there was much else I could do about this, other than get back in my car and head home. It was really weird, and to be honest, I really didn't want to leave. I knew I'd hit something, I just didn't know what it was. I had to leave though. There was nothing I could do, and no evidence of what it was. I just drove home completely perplexed about this. I couldn't come to any meaningful kind of conclusion. I kinda forgot about that incident for a while, but I was reminded of it when a friend of mine called me one night. My friend called me regularly, and we would talk about all sorts of things. That night he called me to tell me that he'd just had a similar experience to mine. He was driving through the same mountain passes, and that was when it happened. He said he'd screeched his car to a halt because he'd hit something, and just like me, when he got out of his car to check, he couldn't find anything at all. He was reminded of my experience, so he got back in that car and left. I thought it was more than a coincidence that both of us had had the same kind of experience, and that got me thinking. I think that someone had set some kind of trap up out there. Let me explain what I believe. I think that someone set something on a fishing line or something with the intention of getting someone to step out of their vehicle. I thought it might have been some sort of carjacking thing. I don't have the greatest car in the world, but my friend does have a nice one. He sunk a lot of money into making it top of the range. We both got out of our cars and weren't robbed at all. That made me think a little more, and I wonder if it was because we were both men, and maybe this was a trap intended for people of the opposite sex. That really unnerves the hell out of me. Naturally, I reported this suspicious occurrence, but it didn't amount to anything. Damn, the mountain roads at night can be really terrifying. This happened back in 2012, when I was still attending college. Me and a few friends of mine opted to band together and rent out a one-bedroom apartment near the campus area. We were a bunch of party animals back then, and we wanted our own place so we could indulge in that lifestyle without worrying about our parents or the school's administration. The apartment complex was located in a rather unsavory part of town. The cops were called out there at least once a week to break up fights or respond to reports of break-ins. All we ever did there was shower and sleep, having to overhear domestic disputes and arguing through the walls all the time. It was just part of the deal, though. One night, my roommates went to a party, while I stayed behind to study for an upcoming exam. Aside from Tupac playing somewhere in the upper levels, things seemed pretty quiet. It was around 11 p.m. or so when I heard a strange sound coming from the hallway outside the front door. It sounded like a large metal object being dragged across the concrete floor. There was also a muffled noise, as if someone was saying something, although I couldn't quite make out what the words were. This went on for about 10 minutes before there was a loud smashing sound. It was at that point I got up and made my way over to the peephole. At first, I didn't really see anything. I just waited and observed to see if anyone would pass by my door. About a minute later, a figure wandered into view and stood between my door and the door opposite from it. It was a Caucasian man. I'll list 3 things that instantly made every alarm bell in my head go off. First off, the man was not wearing a shirt and was profusely sweating. There was also a large axe in the man's right hand that he was dragging behind him. Last but not least, whoever this deranged individual was, he had a black leather gas mask on that completely hid his face from view. I was awestruck at what I was seeing. This was the kind of character you'd see in a low-budget horror movie. This kind of shit doesn't happen in real life. It was a real shock to the system. As if reading my mind, a creepy muffled voice then began singing. As soon as the man finished his verse, he lifted his left leg and heaved the axe into my door. His movement was so fast that it caused me to stumble backward. As I scrambled to my feet, I heard another voice from further down the hallway. "Hey, what the fuck are you doing?" I rushed back to the peephole. The masked man was now gone. To the left of my front door was a fire escape, where he was able to make a quick getaway. I then saw the apartment security guard step into view, with his taser already drawn. "Hey, do you want me to call the police?" I shouted through the door. "Yeah, if you don't mind." "All right, I'm heading out to cut them off." I immediately called the police and explained the situation to them. Unfortunately, the masked man managed to evade both the security guard and the police as well. The complex was surrounded by a small forest, and there were just too many ways for the man to escape. After the lease was up, I moved out of that hellhole. A lunatic pacing up and down the hallway outside my door, wearing a gas mask and dragging an axe behind him, was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was a terrifying experience, but I can look back on it now and sort of laugh a bit. I hope you enjoyed my story, and stay safe out there, guys. I saw a thread a little while ago. I think the title of it was something like, "Has anyone seen a shadow person?" I've never really believed in things like that, but recently I've turned from a skeptic into a believer. I want to share my experience here. You may laugh at me, or you may just feel as if you've seen something similar. The thing I read about said that these shadow beings, if you ever see them, aren't really that harmful. Well, I can't exactly say whether that's true or not. It is just a random thing I found online. I've read some people's experiences where they do seem to be harmful. The shadow thing I saw, though, I'm not exactly sure what was going on. Let me just tell you about what happened, though. It happened while I was waiting in line to board an oncoming train. I was leaving a friend's place. A friend of mine had moved, and I wanted to stop by and wish them well. I was absent-mindedly gazing out towards the tracks when something caught my eye. It was a person. Well, not quite a person, I guess. Something human-shaped that appeared on the tracks. It was raining out, but it wasn't really affecting my vision. I had to blink and rub my eyes to make sure I wasn't seeing things. I couldn't really tell if this figure was a man or a woman. All I could see was a shadow. This is going to sound completely strange, but it almost kind of looked like a television searching for channels but darker. You know, the static sort of thing. One thing I noticed almost instantly, though, about this figure on the tracks was that it appeared to be missing a part of its left leg, just below the knees. I couldn't really make out any facial features of this shadow, obviously. I could tell that the head had a strange shape to it. It looked like part of it had caved in or something. This all probably sounds like the ramblings of a madman. I didn't really have time to fully process or question it, though. There was a train pulling in. I really still thought it was a person on the tracks, despite how strange this appeared. I was shocked that no one else around seemed to be reacting to it. Not one person in the line for the train seemed to see what was unfolding. A tiny announcement rang out along the platform, and we were told the train was approaching and to keep away from the tracks. I thought that if there really was a person there, they were about to be mowed down. I began to panic. I don't think anyone else around me was even paying attention. They were all staring down at their phones and talking with their friends. I heard the train's brakes as it approached the station. It approached the figure, and I clasped my hands to my ears, expecting to hear screams and shouts, but I heard nothing of the sort. Honestly, I thought I was going crazy at that point. The train stopped in front of me, and I decided to take a look back toward the tracks where it had been. I saw that whatever this was, it was still there. I was about to get on the train. I wanted to get away from here as fast as possible. I couldn't believe what I saw next. As I was about to board the train, whatever this thing was peered over at me. Although I couldn't make out any features, I could just feel it looking at me. Next thing I felt was a prodding on my back and a voice snapping me out of my stun. "Miss, can you get out of the way? There are people that want to board the train, you know." Apparently, I was holding up the line, and I hadn't realized until that moment. I didn't really know what else to do other than to apologize and move aside. I backed off the train, causing a bit of a scene. I watched the train leave and saw that shadow thing was now on board with the other commuters. It was looming over a passenger standing by the door, almost appearing to study her. I didn't really know what to think anymore. I worried about that passenger, and I worried about myself too. Was that even real, or was that something that I just imagined in my head and I'm losing it? My name is Jackson Caballero. I'm a 15-year-old sophomore, currently living in Texas. For some backstory, I live in a house with my mom, dad, and my younger brother. My mini Australian shepherd lives there as well. My neighborhood is a safe place, which makes the events of this story even more unsettling. I was the only one awake in my house at the time. It was a typical Monday morning, and I had begun my usual morning routine of making breakfast and watching some YouTube videos. As I sat down, I realized I had left my headphones upstairs, and I would have to go and grab them quickly. For some reason, I'd always had this irrational fear of the second floor of our home. I don't really know why, I just kind of did. I was a bit apprehensive about going upstairs and grabbing my headphones as a result. As I walked up to the second floor, I heard a noise coming from the stairs. I stopped and listened in, but when I didn't hear anything else, I thought to myself that I was being a bit ridiculous. Of course, there was nothing up there. I walked up the stairs and grabbed my headphones off the table, but I was surprised when I turned around. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the bathroom door move, as if someone was hiding behind it and looking at me. Whoever it was tried to duck behind the door, not seeming to notice that I'd seen them. I froze mid-step and turned my face toward the door. All the lights were off inside, and I didn't want to alert whoever was in the bathroom. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, though, I saw a stranger looking at me through the crack in the door. I nearly lost it. I ran down the stairs as quickly as I could and immediately called the police. The operator said to stay on the line, just in case something happened. I heard a loud thud from outside, and it made me look out the window. Whoever had been inside my house had just jumped out of the second-story window and was now limping toward the gate outside. The guy didn't get very far, though. 2 police cars pulled into the driveway and stopped the man. The whole commotion woke up my family, and I had to explain to them and the officers what just happened. The intruder was arrested and ended up getting a prison sentence for breaking and entering. It was about 2 years ago when I was walking to class. I saw a boot in the middle of a crosswalk at my apartment complex. I thought, isn't that odd? I live in a sort of ghetto-ish area, and it was a cold time in the spring. At first, I thought it must be some sort of animal, because it had clearly been run over flat. As I got closer, I noticed it was a boot, and the boot seemed to have some orangish red stuff splattering out of it. It seemed as though this was a foot that someone had run over. It was either a female child or teen's boot. It was even more odd because it was only one, and it didn't seem connected to anything. Here I was staring at a boot with a foot in it that had been run over by someone. I tried to report it to the police and ask around, but no one seemed to know how it got there, or even knew it existed until I showed them, and there was no evidence of how it got there either. Thank you for making it to the end. I'll see you in the next video. Don't forget to subscribe and like.